Well, look, now the man of the hour is Peter Dutton. The new Defence Minister has wasted no time in taking a stand and instilling confidence in those who vote Liberal. While Joe Biden's mucking around doing online climate change conferences with world leaders, and I'll have a bit to say about that tomorrow, massive international crises are brewing. For these so-called world leaders, China and Myanmar should be the only game in town, not climate change. More so, Biden should be picking up the phone to his New Zealand counterpart and giving her an ultimatum. You either stop cozying up to China or we rip up your Five Eyes membership. You choose whatever you want to do. You please yourself, Miss Ardern. Well, Tony Abbott didn't miss when he wrote in the Weekend Australian, quote, "Just 5 years ago, most of us were China optimists. We thought that economic freedom would eventually lead to political liberalisation too. In any event, we thought, provided China was respected in its region, it had no history of larger ambitions, so it would continue to be an economic opportunity rather than a strategic threat." He said that all seemed perfectly realistic then, but looks like wishful thinking now. The former Prime Minister then reminds us how much we need him now. As he summed up the situation, and I quote, "There has been the militarisation of the South China Sea, the bullying of neighbours, even India, the trade boycotts against Australia, the abrogation of the One Country, Two Systems Treaty on Hong Kong, the mass internment of the Uyghurs, and, most dangerous for the wider world, the growing belligerence towards Taiwan, a liberal democracy of 25 million people that should not have to submit just because it was part of China more than 100 years and 2 world wars ago," unquote. And in simple Abbott language, he writes in relation to Taiwan, quote, "It's hard to see how countries that routinely decry human rights abuses in Myanmar or on the West Bank, for instance, and have a history of resisting aggression on the other side of the world, as our respective military histories show, could be indifferent to an armed assault on a fellow democracy." Well, Tony Abbott warned rightly, quote, "What's very real is the Beijing government's determination to retake Taiwan by force if necessary, at least by the 2049 centenary of the Chinese Communist Party's takeover," unquote. Well, Joe Biden should be pulling China aside and telling them the game is up when it comes to the invasion of the South China Sea. Australia and New Zealand should be telling China the game is up when it comes to building military bases in the Pacific region. After all, only a country which harnesses a desire to go to war would amass naval bases all over the Pacific. But no, discussing climate change on a Zoom call takes priority. Biden's administration, as do the rest of the Western world's leadership, remains silent when it comes to Hong Kong and Taiwan and Myanmar. Well, enter the Defence Minister, Peter Dutton. His words at the weekend should fill Australians with hope that for once there's someone in the Cabinet who's prepared to take a stand. Yesterday, appropriately on Anzac Day, when the fight for freedom must mean something, Peter Dutton said, Australia must focus on closer threats. Quote, "China is militarising ports across our region. We need to deal with all that, and that is exactly what we are now focused on," unquote. And then in the light of China invading Taiwan's airspace, Peter Dutton said a war with China over Taiwan, quote, "should not be discounted," unquote. Well, he's correct. And China has got to know that the West is ready for the fight. This all comes as our federal government considers the appropriateness of thousands of arrangements with China that might not be in the national interest, including the 99-year lease of the Port of Darwin to a Chinese-owned outfit. Now, that lease should have been ripped up yesterday. Dutton on the front bench would draw comfort from Matt Canavan on the back bench, because here are others talking climate change and net zero emissions, a policy to make us poorer when we've racked up the biggest debt since World War II. Well, Matt Canavan has said, and I quote, "We can't afford to produce less if we owe more. Net zero is not zero emissions. It's zero jobs for rural Australia. It's a get-out clause for the guilt-ridden, city-based Greens who've realised they can't conveniently reduce their climate sins, but they can conveniently offload that shame to places where they'll never see the devastation," unquote. Peter Dutton and Matt Canavan, both speaking frankly with the Australian public while grassroots coalition voters cheer them on.